If you have a Bible, open up to the book of Acts. If you don't have a Bible, there's Bibles in the chairs around you. Ryan Lillis is completely wrong. It's been a 9-month study, you big sap you. We have 3 Sundays left in the book of Acts. We will finish on Easter Sunday. It was funny. I went up to visit my parents yesterday. They're having a lot of physical trouble. And just went up just to have a cup of coffee and visit and hang out. And I was telling my folks, I said, you know, got 3 sermons left. I'm kind of a little bit tired. It'll be kind of good. And then I'm going to take a 10-week break. And my mother, in good old Midwestern fashion, looked at me and she goes, "A break? Charles Stanley's 82. He doesn't take a break." I mean, what do you say to that? I just crawled out, got in my car, and went home, basically. And I'm still taking a 10-minute break. Nate Milheim will be preaching the entire month of May on one of the Old Testament prophets. We have David Ekman. Dr. David Ekman is going to come. He's going to do a 5-part seminar on basically your family of origin and healthy family perspective and healthy perspectives about yourself. 2 of them will be on Sunday mornings. The other 3 will be on we'll have 1 Friday night and 2 Sunday nights. So it'll be a 5-part seminar over 2 weeks. So you'll want to watch for that. Greg Armstrong just finally informed me this morning he's going to preach for 2 weeks, the last week of June, first week of July. Mr. Reverend Jeff Clipness will be preaching for a couple weeks. And I can tell you what he's going to be preaching on, but I'll be wrong because whatever subject I get him, he does whatever he wants anyway. So there's really no point in me telling you what he's going to preach on because he won't do it anyway. We are in Acts chapter 27. We'll be in the second half of this study, and we'll be beginning in chapter 30, or verse 13. So let me remind you where we are in the story. We're in the very end of the story of the book of Acts, this unfinished scroll, if you will, about the life of the establishment of the church after the resurrection of Jesus. And Paul has been in prison for 2.5 years in Israel, in Caesarea specifically. They finally decide, let's put him on a boat, and let's take him on this boat to Rome to meet Caesar, because that's what he's requested. And just as a reminder to last week, there were no such thing as passenger vessels in the time of Paul. There were trading boats. There were boats that basically just shipped goods. And in the case this morning of what we're looking at, it's a grain ship from Egypt. Egypt was the breadbasket of the entire Roman Empire. It provided over 1/3 of the grain and corn for all of Rome. And so these are trade ships. And what we learned last week was when the ship took off, it took off in a horrible time. Basically, sailing stopped between the date of around November 11th to March 10th. So for 4 months, nobody sailed because it was the dead of winter and you died when you went to sea. So you might ask again, why would they sail at this time? Because the Roman Caesar Claudius and Nero thought this was a grand idea too. They still needed grain. They didn't want the people of Rome, in Rome specifically, to basically create insurrections because they didn't have enough food. So he paid bounties to these sailors and these sailboat owners. If they would sail the treacherous seas in the dead of winter, he would pay them basically this huge bonus to sail during this time. And if they had any damage or loss to the ship, then he would actually replace the ship on top of it. So some of these crazy kind of Captain Queeg sailors would say, I'm all in, this is worth the extra money. If I just take 1 or 2 grain shipments in the middle of winter, I can take the rest of the year off if I want. And that's the time that Paul is on this boat. Lucky him. And they're sailing along. They begin to have a little bit of trouble we looked at last week. And Paul, who's been shipwrecked 3 times already, and in one of those shipwrecks, he spent a full day and another night literally hanging to a plank floating in the ocean, said to the Roman centurion, I think this is not a good idea. Maybe we should park this thing for a while. I'm not in a hurry to crash into the sea. And the Romans talked and the sailors talked and they said, he's all wet, you don't need to listen to him. So they went on with this trip. And that's where we will pick this up in chapter 7, verse 13. When a moderate south wind came up, this is good. This is a good thing. It favors a westerly voyage, which is the direction they're headed. supposing that they had attained their purposes. What that means is, Paul warned them not to do this. They have a really good wind now, so what they're thinking to themselves was, we knew he was all wet, this is working out just fine. So it corroborates their thinking that Paul didn't know what he was talking about. They weighed anchor and began sailing along Crete, close inshore. So they're hugging the island of Crete. But before very long, there rushed down from the land a violent wind called Euraquila. And when the ship was caught in it and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and let ourselves be driven along. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to sail the 36 miles along the shore of Crete to be able to tuck into this little place called Phoenix. Do you see the blow up on the bottom? So they're going along the south of the island of Crete. They try to get into Fair Havens. They can't get in because the wind blows them out of this little port. They keep going, and they want to get into that port of Phoenix. It's covered enough from the winds and from the sea that they can actually winter there. And now they're starting to think, okay, we better stop. Let's try to get into this place called Phoenix. Running under the shelter of a small island called Clauda, we were scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control. After they had hoisted it up, they used supporting cables in undergirding the ship, and fearing that they might run on the shallows of Syrtis, they let down the sea anchor, and in the way let themselves be driven along. So a couple of observations. First of all, ancient ships in this time were not like today. They were not able to navigate into the wind directly. So this wind is pushing them way off course. They're already 23 miles off of where they want to be. And the text says that they basically took cables and tried to gird up the ship. Scholars believe that this is one of two things. Most scholars believe this is an idea called frapping, not fracking like we're familiar with in North Dakota, but frapping. And what they would do is they would take cables, they would pass them under the ship, up the other side, and they would basically, like a giant bunch set of rubber bands, try to rubber band the boat together to hold it together. The other idea that this might be is they've got grain on board. So they may be simply securing the grain, because when grain gets wet, grain expands. When grain expands, it starts popping planks on the boat. So either way, they're really trying to secure this boat. And their fear, the text says in verse 17, is that they were heading to the shallows of Syrtis. The shallows of Syrtis, it's a set of sandbars along the Libyan coast. So if you can see at the bottom down there, the Gulf of Syrtis that I've circled in Libya, that's how far they're afraid they're going to go. That kind of pink triangular section, if you will, that is a series of sandbars that will blow this ship to smithereens. Verse 18. The next day, as we were being violently storm-tossed, they began to jettison the cargo. So you begin to see they're a little bit desperate. They finally decide we better toss some of the goods overboard to lighten the ship. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard and with their own hands. Since neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small storm was assailing us. That's Luke speaking now, because he's on the ship, us. From then on, all hope of our being saved was gradually being abandoned. So the next thing they do is they decide, let's throw the tackle overboard. This is the immense spar. We think of it as a mast, more than likely. And this would take a good portion of the ship to actually lift this thing up and toss it overboard, which would give the ship even less control, which seems odd, but this thing is so tipped and so weighted down, they're trying to toss this over. And notice, they only tossed part of the grain over, and so they're clinging to what they view as their lifeblood, which is their money. Let's not throw all of that over. Let's throw the mast over first, because the last-ditch effort is to take this trip and make zero money on it. And so to me, it's humorous to me because I'm not on the ship. But I want you to picture Paul on this boat. He's a real guy, by the way, in case you haven't noticed. And so here's a guy that 2.5 years earlier, Jesus showed up in a vision. The killed Jesus, resurrected Jesus, shows up in a vision, and he tells Paul, here's what we're going to do. A little bit like Ryan's deal. we're going to go to Jerusalem. That's what I want you to do. You'll be there just for a little bit. And then I'm going to take you to Rome, and you're going to be able to share the gospel in Rome, and you're going to be able to meet with the churches in Rome, and then on maybe to Spain. So this is in Paul's mind. So he says, I'm all in. He goes to Jerusalem. He gets arrested, beaten, just horrible. He's locked in prison, just salting away for 2+ years. He gets on a boat in the middle of winter, having been shipwrecked 3 times already, having spent a day and a night holding onto a plank. This is not what a Jew really calls a good time. Now the boat gets a little trouble. He warns the sailors, don't do this. They blow him off. Now he himself, because they're being blown so far off course, is helping them lift the mast to toss it overboard. Could you imagine what is in this guy's mind? I mean, I would be having some conversations with God at this point. Like, what are you doing? Right? And part of our problem when we think of our Christian life and our faith is, and I've talked about this for 3.5 years, we think of faith as if it's a constant. And it's a lousy way to think, right? And here's how I know it's not. I just need one example from the Bible, and it proves to me it's not. Abraham in the Old Testament, right? Abraham was an old guy God promised to give a kid. In Romans, which is the book we'll start in July, Paul says of Abraham, he never wavered in unbelief in regards to the promise God gave him about having a kid. And yet, I've read the story a whole bunch of times. He in Doug's mind wavered a ton. So did he waver or did he not waver? Well, this is how God defines faith. Wavering to God is not a lack of faith. It's the willingness to waver and stop yourself like Ryan did and say, I know you told me to get off on this exit, but I want to get off on this exit. And again, God politely says, I got a better exit for you. And he struggles and thinks and struggles and thinks what I would call wavering. God doesn't call wavering at all. And he says, wow, look at this dude wrestle with me. This is faith. See, it's the consistent path of life that God defines as faith. There's no way when Paul is lifting this mast that he is not having a serious conversation with himself and God saying, really? Really, Jesus, thanks for the vision. This is your trip to Rome that I took 2.5 years rotting in a prison to get to? There's no way this dude is not having this conversation with God. And God says, way to wrestle with me. I'll do this all day long with you, Paul. You actually acknowledge my existence. This is all I'm looking for. And Paul works himself to a place like Ryan did, of faith. I think this is a beautiful picture. And to make matters worse, there's no stars, there's no moon, they're running blind. This is the definition of lost at sea. Verse 21. And when they had gone a long time without food, we'll find out what that means in a little bit, then Paul stood up in their midst and said, Men, you ought to have followed my advice and to not have set sail for Crete and incurred this damage and loss. And yet now I urge you to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you. The ship, not so good. Now, when Doug reads this, because Doug has perfected this in over 50 years, Doug reads, I told you so. And I can tell you, with 50 years of perfecting this, I've never had the I told you so work. I'm committed to keep trying, but it's never worked for me. Because the I told you so is completely ego-driven, isn't it? Lynn and I have this game we play with each other because we know how fragile our egos can be. And so something will happen and we'll find out the other one's right. And then we look at the other one says, you are right. You were right, Doug. Or I would say, you were right, Linda. And it's this game we play to tease ourselves and to realize what egos we have, how much we need to be right. This is not what Paul is doing. This is actually not an I told you so. And you can see that because of what he does with it. This is Paul being a prophet. And what Paul is saying was, I warned you once, and you didn't listen. And the reason I'm bringing that up is, I'm warning you a second time, and this one's actually coming from my God. And I would really, really, really listen to this second. That's the only reason he's doing this. Which I think is so different than my experience. And you also see that his warning is surprisingly upbeat. Not for the ship owner, but for everybody else. This is about, look, God is going to keep you alive. That's the only thing you really need to know in this point in time. We'll learn later, by the way, that they're not eating, poor English, because they don't have any food. They're not eating because they're so seasick. They're so sick, they literally can't eat at this time. Let's read on. Verse 23. For this very night, Paul says, an angel of the God, not God, the angel of the God to whom I belong. This is a really deep Greek word coming out of the Hebrew. It's the word God used, and it's the word Jesus used to refer to himself as the I am. So what Paul is saying was, the God who I am with, the existent one, the God who takes his fingers every second and squishes my lungs so that I breathe. The God who every second does this in my heart so my heart keeps beating. I have a bunch of doctor friends, and I have some really neat Christian doctor friends. Any good doctor will tell you, we can explain to you how the body works, we just don't know why the body works. We have no idea why the heart keeps going. Now, once it pumps, I can tell you where it sends everything. I have no idea why it keeps going. I can even tell you when it stops, why it stopped. I just can't tell you why it keeps going. This is what Paul's saying. This God of mine, who is my literal existence, came to me and talked to me, and whom I serve, stood before me, saying, verse 24, do not be afraid. Paul, you must stand before Caesar. And this is the third time God has shown up and told him this, by the way, in case you don't think he has struggles. And behold, God has granted you all of those who are sailing with you. Therefore, keep up your courage, men. For I believe God that it will turn out exactly as I have been told. I will give God the benefit of the doubt, Paul says. But we must turn around and go to some island that he told me about that I actually don't even know where it is. I love that too. I love how the Bible is specific when they have specifics and not specific when they don't. Paul has never been to this area. He doesn't know. This is the island of Malta. He doesn't know. But when he tells this to the sailors, I think they know this area well enough. They're thinking, wow, he must be talking about the island of Malta. What these sailors are hoping is that they're going to land on the boot of Sicily up here. But they're blowing south. But they know there's an island below that, and so they know they're not going to hit this island. They also know that this boat is falling apart, and there's no way it's going to make it another 200 miles to hit the coast of Africa. So they're hoping that this guy is telling them something accurate. Verse 27. But when the 14th night came, I love how the Bible just rolls over that one. That's 2 weeks last time I checked. As we were being driven about in the Adriatic Sea, that's the entire area surrounding Sicily and Malta and even down into Crete. About midnight, the sailors began to surmise that they were approaching some land. And they took soundings. So what happens is, they're in the pitch dark, they can see nothing, but they hear breakers. They hear the sound of ocean slapping land. And they know the sound, so they know there's something in front of them. I gotta remember what verse it is now. Just lost my place. So they take soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. That's roughly 120 feet. And they wait a little bit, and they took another sounding and found it to be 90 feet, or 15 fathoms. So the ground is coming up towards the boat. So they know they're heading towards these breakers. Fearing that we might run aground, somewhere on the rocks, they cast 4 anchors from the stern and wished for daybreak. 14 days, by the way. This is again why I think the Bible is so fascinating. Scholars have tested the sincerity of this word and wondered under these conditions, how long would it take to sail from the island of Cauda to Malta? 476.6 miles. They said it would be pretty much exactly 14 days. Coincidence? I think not. And they arrived in Malta, and they're pulling into what is now known today as the Bay of St. Paul. And they would, again, have heard these breakers, and they begin to say, let's test how deep it is. And the way they tested, from everything I've studied, was they had these giant lead balls with holes in them, and they would pack these holes with grease. You'll love this, Tom. And they put them on lengths of rope that they measured, and they would lower the rope down, raise it up, and then this grease in these holes would drag along the ground, pick up the debris. They would not only know how deep it was, but exactly what kind of ground there is underneath them. So they do it once, it's 120 feet. They do it again, now it's 90. It's coming up quickly, so they know by the time they're having this conversation now, they may be into 40, 50 feet of water. It's coming up very quickly. So they start dropping a series of anchors to drag the boat, to slow the boat down. Fascinatingly enough, again, archaeologists have studied St. Paul's Bay. And underneath the water, they have found, listen to this, a series of anchors that ships have used to drag along to slow themselves down. Unfortunately, what they found at the end of these series of anchors every time was a sunken ship. So, not a good thing. Verse 30, when day came and they could not recognize the land, but they did observe a bay with a beach, they resolved to drive the ship onto it if they could. And casting off the anchors, they left them in the sea, while at the same time they were loosening the ropes of the rudders. So they're now saying, don't put any drag on this boat. Let's let this boat go as fast as it can. And their concern is, again, we hear the shore, we see a beach kind of, we hear the breakers, the land is coming up towards the boat, but if we don't hit this island, it's not huge, we'll blow right past it, and then we're dead. So they're going through this series of processes to try to speed the boat up now. So casting up the anchors, they left them at sea, they loosen the ropes and the rudders, and they hoist the foresail in the wind, heading to the beach to speed it up. But striking a reef where two seas met, they ran the vessel aground, and the prow struck fast and remained immovable, but the stern began to be broken up by the forces of the sea. Did I skip a massive part?
Yeah.
I did. Pretend you didn't read that.
Read what?
How did I do that?
Verse 30.
Oh, what is with you people? Are we not friends? Can't somebody say, excuse me, what are you doing? That's Jeff's job. I'm looking to you people to help me. Go back to verse 30. Now the two of you that are tired are saying, darn, I was so close to the finish. But as the sailors were trying to escape the ship, that's what I meant to read, and had let down the ship's boat into the sea on the pretense of intending to lay out anchors from the bow. So the sailors say, this is not going well. Let's sneak to the front. Let's pretend that we're letting anchors down the front, but let's actually let the lifeboat down, jump on, and get the heck out of here. Paul said to the centurion who was in charge of all the soldiers who now had commandeered this boat, and I'm so sorry I jumped ahead, unless these men remain in the ship, you yourselves cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it fall away. Until the day was about to dawn, Paul was encouraging them all to take some food, saying, today is the 14th day that you have been constantly watching and going without eating and have taken nothing. Therefore, I encourage you to take some food, for this is your preservation. For not a hair in your head of any of you will perish. Just a couple of quick comments on this. First of all, this tells you how bad this is. Sailors are saying, every man for himself. Get on the lifeboat. Which is kind of a bad idea anyway. Well, let's get on a smaller boat. I don't really get that. And on top of it, just how selfish this is. This is just, forget everybody else. I'm going to save my own skin. And finally, the light goes off with the Roman guy. This tall guy and this God he has may be onto something. He did warn us once and it was good advice, and we blew it off. Now he's warning us again. Let's listen to this guy. So when trouble hits after 2 weeks, this Romans light goes on. And this is the experience of my life. This is so how I've seen my life go. In relationship to people who are not of the faith of Jesus. We get to know people in life. And we get to know them not over, say, weeks or months. We get to know people over years, right? And I have many people that I've befriended that don't care about God, have no spiritual interest whatsoever. They're just doing their work thing and trying to get ahead and go on vacation and raise their kids and hope they make an all-star team. My life is full of, and that's, I get it. And so sometimes in those moments we get frustrated because we've got this faith, we've got this thing with God. Again, I'm going to keep pointing back to Ryan's illustration. We have something the world doesn't have, and it's so beyond anything else we've ever attained. We want everybody else to experience it. Because we know we've got the answer to life. It's relationship with God. It's being back in connection with the one who created us to begin with. But they have no spiritual interest whatsoever. Do you have friends like this? And you can't figure it out because they're cool people, they're deep people, but they just never. And you toss these little thoughts out, like, oh, where were you today? I was at church. Or I was having dinner with some friends from church. Or yeah, I just prayed for this thing, it was really weird. And there's nothing, right? There's no hook on the end of that fishing line. There's just, you're shaking your heads, you all know this experience. So here's what we do in our fleshly self. We try to drive this thing forward. And we think we're motivated really well, but it's really quite fleshly. It's everything we're learning not to do in this book of Acts. We step out of the movement of God and we start to push. And we know what this push feels like. We know what it feels like. And what I've learned in this, if I stay in step with God, what I've learned in this is one of two things. First of all, just over time, people see how different your life looks. And I mean 10, 15, 20 years. I had a buddy, and he is a put-together buddy. He is so beyond me and put together. He circles laps on me and being put together. Great dad, great husband, just successful business guy. Zero interest in the family. And it fascinates me. And I've even had a little conversation with him. Nothing, just nothing. And he said to me a couple months ago, my wife and I gave a check to this non-profit organization he was involved in. And he said to me, it's this little email. I looked it up yesterday because I thought, I want to see exactly what he said. He had one little sentence, thank you, and then all it said was, your faith and your pursuit of knowledge inspires me. I thought, what a comment. Right? There was no God thing attached to that, by the way, directly, but there is. It's you pursue this knowledge of this book and this God that I don't get at all, and then you have this faith to trust Him. It moves me. Wow. More often, though than not, what happens in these relationships is the ugly hits. No matter how long you're here in life, you will not escape here without the ugly. There's a darkness that hits us. And we have these deep friendships, and I've experienced this too, where there's no interest, but we stay in this relationship because it's a relationship. And we try to stay within the Spirit of God, and the ugly hits, and then they notice there's something about you and your situation that when the ugly hit you, is different than how I'm responding to the ugly. And I'd like to see what yours is about. I've used this example probably too many times, but Doug Abbott is the greatest example I've seen of this. He just goes to the firehouse every couple days, does his shift, he lives for God, he loves people, he's normal, he's cool, he's not judgmental. They throw porn on in the firehouse, he just leaves, it's just not into it. Whatever, enjoy yourself, it's just not really what my life is all about. And sooner or later, about once a year, one of those firemen's life falls apart, and who do they go to? They go to Doug. They call Doug, and they say, can we have coffee? My wife's been cheating on me, and my whole life just can we go to coffee? My son's getting into trouble, and you have this sense about parenting that I don't have. Will you meet with me? But if we step outside of the movement of God, we will screw that up so bad. Let's keep reading as you pretend that you haven't read this. Having said this, he took bread. Paul takes some bread and he gives thanks to God in the presence of all. And he broke it and began to eat. And all of them were encouraged, and they themselves also took it. So look what Paul does. He says, let's eat. We need to eat something. So they've got food. They haven't eaten for 2 weeks. They're so sick. Paul says, you need food because this last bit is going to be worse than everything else that we've done. And he takes some bread, and I know we like to turn this into communion. This is not a communion moment. This is just a meal. And Paul does what any Jew would do. He takes the bread and he says to God, thank you for this bread. He's just thanking God. See, we screw this up. We pray before we eat, and then we ask God to bless the meal, which is, if any Jew were sitting at your table, they would say, what are you doing? That is the blessing. You're asking me to bless something that I've already given you is the blessing. When we pray before a meal, if we want to, what we do is we say, God, thank you. Because without you, I wouldn't be eating right now. And that's all Paul's doing. And can you imagine how strange this would be to all these people on this boat, the prisoners, the sailors, the Romans? We're dying at sea after 2 weeks of being blown everywhere, and you're going to thank your God for this? How odd this must look to these people in this situation. Verse 37. All of us, there's Luke again, in the ship were 276 persons. And when they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship, throwing out the wheat in the sea. Do you see now the perspective change? Suddenly, the rest of the money doesn't matter so much. There's a light coming on in their soul. And when day came, they could not recognize the land. But they did observe. Let me stop for a second. Again, what did they notice about Paul? Paul, in this situation, it's not just his words. It's more about what he was like. He's thankful to God in the midst of the worst situation. He's humble and realizes that he's not in control of his life. God is. And he's the only one that can still this problem. Here's a good one. Paul's not a victim. Paul doesn't say, you're complaining. This is my 4th time I've been into this situation. You have nothing to complain, like a Jew would do, right? You have nothing to complain about. I'm the worst of any of you. How could I be in this situation again? There's no victim in this guy whatsoever. Nothing crazy, just humble, thankful, calm, trusting, just he's at ease. And these people watch that. And they take heart, they get courage out of it, they start eating, and they loosen their grip on what they thought was important and finally throw the cargo overboard that they're clinging to. Isn't that fascinating what this guy's life, just doing life with God, looks like to a foreigner to the faith? Now we'll go back. Verse 37. I can't seem to read the verses in the right order. 39, excuse me. When day came, they did not recognize the land, but they did observe a bay or the beach, and they resolved to drive the ship onto it if they could. And casting off the anchors, they left them in the sea, while at the same time they were loosening the ropes of the rudders. I already explained all this. And hoisting the foresail, so they're trying to speed in to hit this land so they don't blow off course again and miss the whole island. But striking a reef, where 2 seas meet, this is called, when you thought things couldn't get any worse, they can. They ran the vessel aground, the prow struck fast, remained immovable, but the stern began to be broken to pieces and fall apart. So this thing is coming apart at the seams. And unfortunately now, they're hitting what they found in St. Paul's Bay, which is a deep gravel bar. It's a rocky gravel bar underneath, and it's starting to blow the whole ship apart. The soldiers, verse 42, their plan was to kill the prisoners so that none of them would swim away and escape. But the centurion, wanting to bring Paul safely through, kept them from their intention and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land. And the rest should follow, some on planks and others on various things from the ship. And so it happened that they were all brought safely to the land. We'll stop here. Next week we'll look at what happens on this trippy little island of Malta. Let me close by circling back to just this one point that we've seen in Paul so beautifully since probably chapter 9 of the book of Acts. He stays in step with the Spirit. I was just talking to Scott and Bonnie Summers about this. This idea that I only want to move when God is moving, right? It's the movement of Moses. When Moses said to God, if you go, I'll go, but if you stay, I'll stay, but I won't do anything other than those two choices. This is the life of Paul. And in relationships, Paul doesn't push them forward, right? This is God nudging him. This is, again, to Ryan, your point. You have a plan which God loves. And then when God says, great plan, got a better one, what he expects us to do is get behind him and walk with him in that plan. Now, we don't do that all the time because we're arrogant, quite frankly. But Paul, in particular when it came to relationships, and in particular when it came to relationships with people that did not have a faith in God, that did not buy into the fact that Jesus died for our sins, when he was in that situation, he did not push. He did not have a, you know what this is? It's a tightness. It's, you know the situation where you're in this conversation and the thought is in your head, oh my gosh, I don't know what to say. I've got to come up with something pithy to say in this moment. That's when you're pushing. I shared that story where last week I was with Albert, this buddy of mine, and we had our coffee. We're walking down the Ironhorse Trail, and this crazy wild man rides up on his bike, and he's telling us to chant this chant. And I'm telling you, I grabbed his card, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this is just a crazy card. Then I put it in my pocket, I'm thinking, you're so stupid. Why'd you put the card? It's probably going to burn your pocket. You know, all this crap's just going on in my head, and Albert's just calm, and I can't see him though, he's behind me. And the whole time I'm just blank. I just blank. And I know you're all thinking, he's never blank, he's always talking. I had nothing in this moment. So here's what I did. I said, God, I've got nothing because you've given me nothing. So if you're not going to give me anything, can you give something to the guy behind me and have him handle it? And 30 seconds later, Albert stepped up. The guy paused, which was shocking. And Albert spoke. And the guy didn't listen to any of it, but it didn't matter to me. That's staying in step. See, in this moment, we have to remember the goal. There's two goals, really, when we're in relationship with somebody that doesn't have any spiritual thought about God or movement towards God. First of all, the goal is to stay in step with the Spirit of Jesus. That's the goal. That's the goal. Because wherever God is, that's the right spot. So if I can somehow stand next to God wherever God is, I'm in the right spot. Which includes keeping your mouth shut sometimes. And in my case, on that Ironhorse Trail, I had nothing to say. Now I had a bunch of stuff I could have made up. I could tell it was made up. You know what I mean? The difference. This wasn't that. This was, I had nothing and I don't want to go there. So if I stand right where Jesus is, I'm in the right spot. That's goal one. Goal two is relationship with this person. It's not to change their mind. It's not to get them to think what I think. It's not even, dare I say, to convert somebody to my thinking or God's. It's love. It's love. Had I pushed with my buddy who had no spiritual desire, he would have never, 10 years later, said to me, your faith and your knowledge inspire me. What he would have done was ditched me 8 years earlier because I was just pushing you-know-what, that just driving him crazy and arrogant and trying to make him think what I think. And really, that would be abhorrent to who he is. I love this guy deeply. And I respect him and I respect what he thinks. So we have to stay in that place. It's hard because we know what we feel. We know the completeness of what it means to have Jesus wash our sins. Don't we? We know what it's like to have this life with God. It's so deep and rich and beyond anything else we've ever experienced. We know that. But then we can't take that and drive that into people. What we do is we love. We love and we love and we love and we love. With no goal other than love. And if we do it long enough, the ugly of this world will come our way. And we'll be deeply bonded that it has. And by the grace of God, they may have seen in us what they saw in Paul for 2 weeks, which is, I don't get him, but he's got something. And then we'll hope God gives us something to say. Let's pray. Thank you, Father, that you take the pressure off of us. You fill us to where we're just overflowing with this feeling and sense of awe and wonder and beauty and joy and just a deep wholeness about our life. And it feels so good that if we just stand next to you and stay in that moment, it just starts dripping on people around us. Father, give us the mindset to simply stay at that place where we're watching what you're doing. Not pushing, not ego-driven. Just listening and experiencing love from you and letting that love pour into people. And thank you that you have chosen to just partner with us in this so we get to watch you overturn marriages. We get to watch you repair marriages and repair frustrated parents and kids going off scale and people losing jobs and being frustrated. You get to bring us to the front seat of the stadium to watch you work in a way that we never could otherwise. We're privileged people, and we thank you. We pray these things in the name of Jesus.